Get ready to flex a muscle because you're stopping off at the card pool. I'm your host, Stu Galetta.
And I'm Kyle Robertson.
And today we're taking in a look at Judgment. And also we're doing that in the flesh.
We are indeed, Stu. And this is, again, part one of our multi-part set review of Judgment. We're going to be looking at the very beginning of our hidden gems from this set. But without further ado, let's start this review.
Let's indeed. And let's start off at my number 10, Kyle. And what a card this is.
Ooh.
This land is very unique, so let's break it down first by what it just does. So it's a generic land in which it comes into play untapped and can produce one generic mana, one colorless. But it also has a secondary effect where as long as this card is in your graveyard, all lands you control have the ability to tap to produce either green or white mana. So this is a very unique card because it does something a lot of lands don't do. I mean, they all do inherently fix your mana, so this way you can go ahead and you can filter out for anything else you really need it to be. But in green-white, it's very unusual. Green, yes, it has access to dredge-like mechanics and likes the grave. But white really doesn't have that kind of strength there. And if you really think about it, this really reminds me of a card kind of like Chromatic Lantern, for example.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
You can, for literally what it's trying to do is just make all your lands have the accessibility to be what you want them to be. So this is a really good card for the same reason that Chromatic Lantern is a good card, provided that you're running these colors. But outside of Chromatic Lantern style, I mean, Kyle, where do you think about this?
Well, see, one of the caveats of running a card like this is that it's only really good in the graveyard, obviously, and there are certain ways to actually make that happen that are very convenient for you. One of them is cards like Crop Rotation and Harrow. This is just off the top of my head here, but cards like this that allow you to sacrifice lands in order to do different sorts of things, in this case mostly get other lands, are really, really great with a card like Riftstone Portal, because not only can you play this down and maybe get mana from it, but then sacrifice it again and get an added benefit, and plus, this is in your graveyard, now your lands tap for pretty much whatever color you need. But kind of as you were saying, Stu, I wouldn't necessarily think about running this outside a really dedicated green and white deck. If you get into 3 or more colors, I just think there are better options for you.
Yeah, definitely. But I mean, you could do a workaround with some sort of mechanics. Green does have some stuff that involves the grave, but it's not very common. You would have to do a really hard workaround for it. And I mean, I'm not really sure the deck would be that consistent even.
Nah, not really. I mean, there are some cards of green that let you filter through your top several cards, get rid of some to the graveyard. That might help too, but not quite as consistent, definitely. But overall, really, really cool pick, Stu. I really like the fact that this land exists.
Yeah, me too. But enough of mine, Kyle. What do you got for your number 10?
All right, well, going on to my number 10 here, starting off my list, it's a card called Shaman's Trance. I'm going to a red card right off. It's an instant that costs 3 mana, 2 colorless, and 1 red, and it's an instant, as I said, until end of turn, other players can't play cards from their graveyards, and you may play cards from other players' graveyards as though they were in your graveyard. Now, the main reason I picked this card is not because I really had any real application for it in mind, but just because I thought it was super weird. When you think about stealing stuff and cards that do that, red's actually getting a little bit more of a foothold in that kind of effect, but usually that was sort of a blue and or black or both thing. So where the heck would you use a card like this? I really have no idea. I think it would probably go along with such red cards as Grenzo, Havoc Razor, or Neheb the Eternal, either stealing stuff or getting more mana so you can play the things that you're about to steal with something like Shaman's Trance, for example. But the timing of this card is really, really tricky, as I'm sure you could probably figure out.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I mean, inherently, when you first showed me this card, I was baffled. I was like, I'm not even sure this does what you think it does. And then I was like, well, maybe it's more of a meta choice. Like, you're really going to be going ahead and ruining someone's strategy. And if you think about it, some very common cards that you do see in Commander or Magic in general, you have cards like Snapcaster Mage, Yawgmoth's Will, and Recoup. And they're very powerful cards. So being able to completely have a strategy that can hose them is really good. Even if you aren't going to play the card, you inherently made them waste something that could be a game ender. But if you do get the value to go ahead and steal their cards, yeah, you're getting value on value. Now, this is a little 3-drop instant, so I mean, for a little kind of, I don't know, tech card like this, seems a little niche for me, but it is something to take note of. It is something that red can't typically do, so I can see why you're saying it. This is something to take note of.
Yeah, and people won't always have great cards in their graveyard. Not every deck revolves around the graveyard, but a significant amount do, and plenty of decks throw away cards early in the game that could actually be of use to you later on if you're in red. Maybe a Kodama's Reach or a ramp spell like that, for example.
Yeah,
you know,
it
just
needs that.
thinking of. So there are ways of making this work. It's just, since an instant is kind of weird, I would usually play this as a sorcery because I feel like that's when you're probably going to get the most use out of it. But also, it can stop graveyard tricks on other people's turns at instant speed in a red card, which is kind of weird and also maybe worth thinking about.
Oh, and also another one you didn't really say is like the Scarab God. That's one that you see all over the place now. So being able to stop that for just one turn, I mean, that can make or break the game just for that deck.
Not bad, but if you want to do stuff on other people's turns, probably, you'd have to somehow enable yourself to have flash all the time, which is a whole other story entirely. So I think we should go on to something else before we just go down the rabbit hole here.
That's fair. So we'll kick it into my roundhouse with number 9. Now this card over here is a little one called Pulse Mage Advocate. Now it is a creature that costs 2 generic and a white on a 1/3 body. And it's a cleric, probably also a human as well if you look into the Oracle. And it has a tap effect. Return 3 target cards from an opponent's graveyard to his or her hand, and then in turn, return target creature from your graveyard to play. So this is a very strong, goofy, almost teammate card, because again, we have tons of formats like Two-Headed Giant and the new Battle Bond that's coming out, and I mean, anytime you can make a political ally, it's always really powerful. But we do see this effect in white as well, with other cards such as Sun Titan, Karmic Guide, and Revelark, in which they are known staples of white for how strong they are for being able to make combos happen at the ease of just pretty much as soon as they enter the battlefield. And they're really reoccurable, and each one can go ahead and pretty much almost return one of these cards, so it's really, really powerful.
Yeah, I really, really want to like this card because it's a tap ability. Tap abilities are so easily abusable with any number of different things, so you could use this potentially multiple times in the same turn, and that would be really, really good. So I really want to like it because of that, but also it has a fairly large drawback of giving your opponents back their cards that they already spent to the graveyard. I really don't like that. I really don't like the idea of giving other people back their cards. It just feels really bad, but I guess in some cases the payoff is maybe worth it. It could be.
I mean, it also depends on what's in your grave. Like, if you have an Elish Norn or, I mean, pretty much any overpowered creature, yeah, why not put this into play? Like, I'll gladly give you 3 cards that you can't even use for the most part if you can't even have them hit the field. So, it's very situational, a little niche, but something I've rarely seen played. I mean, I have played against a couple group hug decks, and they love this card for the fact that it makes it so that they get allies in 2 seconds.
You know, why isn't, now that I'm thinking of it, why weren't these cards, the whole Advocate cycle, there's a number of them, why weren't they reprinted in Battle Bond? It seems like the perfect thing for that, although with teammates it might be slightly overpowered. I guess I could see that, but still.
Well, yeah, totally. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, if I was doing some sort of stylization with that, I would gladly throw these cards in one of those kind of decks.
Well, moving on to the next card on our list here, my number 9. It is another white card, actually, an enchantment this time, called Soulcatcher's Eerie. This is a 2-drop enchantment, costs 1 colorless and 1 white. Whenever a bird is put into your graveyard from play, put a feather counter on Soulcatcher's Eerie, and all birds get +1/+1 for each feather counter on Soulcatcher's Eerie. This is a fairly powerful piece of tribal support, but the catch is it's for birds. You don't really see a whole lot of bird tribal going on in Magic. I mean, it's in white and blue somewhat, but there's just not a whole lot of support for it over the course of time. It's not really a big thing. You do see a lot of cards that make bird tokens, but possibly that could be the basis for some kind of deck. I don't know. We're actually going to talk about more later on in some of these videos. But the way I see it, this wouldn't really work in a format like Commander because there's just not enough birds to really make a deck to support. I think this is probably better in other kinds of formats, but you might disagree.
I mean, yes and no. I mean, I am a person to say bird is the word, and that is definitely the word with this card, Kyle. I mean, personally, for what it does, I'd rather a card like Ghostly Prison, for example, which is just flat out good across the board. So this is a little bit more niche for that it is something that's in a tribal-like staple. Because, I mean, why not make it so that everyone's getting hurt for this? Like, it's this one kind of involves combat / tricks and trinkets, so I don't really know. But I mean, you are right. There are certain cards that can go ahead and help this out that do produce bird tokens. And a couple off the top of my head, you have stuff like Ameria Angel, you have Fable of Wolf and Owl, which isn't really in white, but I mean, I'm sure you can play it in advance. And also Pride of the Clouds, which just goes ahead and you forecast it, just go ahead and make it so you have a little bird out there. So they are seen across the board, but I mean, you can also potentially commanders that can go ahead and, well, they are birds, so they would totally work with this. And they are always dying cards like Ishia, Ojutai's Dragon Speaker, and also Derevi, who, I mean, is probably one of the most hated creatures with how it works, more or less because of wizard synergies. But if you can go ahead and make this card a bird, go ahead, keep whooping him in and out of play like this, yeah, you can make it so that you can go ahead and get huge advantage from this little card that you have here, Kyle.
Yeah, that would probably be a really fun thing to do. And the nice thing about something like Soulcatcher's Eerie is when tokens get killed off, they do technically go to the graveyard before they fizzle out and cease to exist. So they do put counters on this card and do make all of your birds bigger. And that accumulation is just really, really powerful because it's just going to keep getting more so over the course of the game. Still, I think probably the best home for this is in a casual, kitchen table, 60 card deck sort of thing where everybody just plays whatever they want. You can stick 4 copies of this in a deck, 4 copies of pretty much any other good bird in Magic, and that might be fun. I'd do that.
It could work. Yeah, I mean, maybe the workaround for this card hasn't truly been invented yet for what we've seen from Wizards, but take note while you got the chance. This is definitely a budget option that can be powerful in the late games.
Oh yeah, and speaking of budget options, this next card, I mean, wow, for budgets, this is pretty solid, yeah.
Alright, so my number 8 is going to a red enchantment here called Planar Chaos. It costs 3 mana, 2 generic, and a red. And it reads, at the beginning of your upkeep, flip a coin. If you lose the flip, sacrifice Planar Chaos. But whenever a player plays a spell, that player flips a coin. If he or she loses the flip, counter that spell. So this is a super duper unique, goofy chaos card in red that does something that red typically never has access to. Counter spells. And red would love to have counter spells because how many times is red just straight up vulnerable to blue? Blue and red
really
hate each other completely. And go ahead, you play your entire turn, leave 3 mana open, play this at the end. Your opponents are going to have one heck of a turn until it goes around the table. And I mean, this can still stick around if you go ahead and get lucky enough. Or if you're playing a coin flipping deck, those truly aren't the strongest kind of formats of tier ranking. So, I mean, it could work. It could exist. There are elements out there for it. But, I mean, if you're comparing this to also cards that are other counterspells, such as Pyroblast, Mage's Contest, and Red Elemental Blast, like these are strictly, I guess, a little better, even though they are conditional. I mean, the Blast and the Elemental Blast are pretty much just like haters against blue, but the Mage's Contest, I think, is, and as far as I thought until I saw this card, was the only true counterspell that red has. So this really is unique.
Yeah, I know this is just going to be part of that stupid coin flip deck that's coming out of Battle Bond, and I sort of love it, I'll admit it. But I think this makes me a little nervous because it's based entirely on chance. I mean, you could flip a coin the first time, and it could backfire on you by countering your own stuff or making you sacrifice it before it even does anything to anyone else. I just hate that kind of uncertainty.
Oh, come on.
And
it's
sure,
so
hey,
worth it.
well, sure there are a couple cards that can help you out with that, but in a chaos strategy, I think this really rules because you don't really mind if some things backfire on you as long as it's a bigger pain for pretty much everybody else, and this can stop people's plays and strategies dead, unlike most things that red can do. So it's very powerful and very interesting.
Well, and like you said, with countering your own stuff, you really wouldn't want this in like a deck in which you are constantly like using spell slinging to try to burn your opponents or burn the board. But if you're doing something that builds token armies in which you're just using effects and tapping mana, you're not casting anything. You're just utilizing your mana in different ways. So this won't hurt you.
Right.
I mean, this will, and again, you only are going to play this at the very end of your turn in which you can get all the advantage and hurt everyone else. So it's more or less if it sticks around, then you might have a problem. But again, everyone's having that problem. Let them solve it, not you.
It's interesting. Yeah. Definitely worth a look for any fans of Chaos Magic out there. I know I like it sometimes. This is still a little bit risky for me, but it's possible. Yeah, very good thing to know.
It's 50-50, Kyle. But either way, onto your wheelhouse of the color pie.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of, we actually went over a card much like this before, but number 8 on my list is Web of Inertia. This is a blue enchantment that costs 3, 2 colorless and a blue. At the beginning of each opponent's combat phase, that player may remove a card in their graveyard from the game. If that player doesn't, creatures he or she controls can't attack you this turn. So this is very reminiscent of certain other enchantments that do a very similar kind of thing, like the aforementioned Ghostly Prison. It's really, really like that, or the Propaganda, which is the blue version of Ghostly Prison. But the difference with Web of Inertia is that this one is much more conditional, and it's easier to get around, because instead of having to tap a solid amount of mana to get through the attack phase, all you have to do as an opponent is just exile a card from your graveyard. I think this is worth noting, though, because blue doesn't normally get a ton of grave hate, except if you're looking at cards that mass shuffle graveyards into decks. They do exist, but there's not a ton of them. Straight up exiling, though, that's not something that generally really happens, and that can be punishing for decks that really like to use their graveyard and are aggressive.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I think it's a little niche, but it is a workaround. It is something unusual that blue typically doesn't have. Usually they go through artifacts to make sure they can control the grave. But again, it's a runaround. You have to be able to get that card, and blue's only really able to tutor, for instance, in sorceries. So, I mean, if you are able to consistently get this a little better, by all means, run it. And your opponents are going to not truly enjoy playing against this card, especially if they like stuff in their grave. Any dredge deck, any kind of reanimator strategy, or any kind of just like, I don't know, play from the grave like Muldrotha from the new set that just came out, they're not going to be particularly happy about this card. So this is a good arsenal pick.
Well, and actually, for a lot of decks that don't rely on the graveyard, this can be a lot more powerful against them, because they may throw maybe a couple cards into the graveyard early in the game, but most of the time their graveyard is going to be very small unless you're the one that's like destroying their things or something like that. So this could actually shut somebody down pretty quickly if it comes down early enough, and that's something to be said too.
But if it comes down early enough, late game, it's not really going to feel too good if
Probably
this comes
not,
down.
no.
So a little timing, but again, interesting card, does work, and a solid budget option.
Definitely, and more budget options coming up. At this time, a multicolored one, Stu. Tell us about this one.
And I'm going to be on the enchantment train for my number 7. Not easy to say that. Try doing that as a tongue twister. But my number 7 is a card called Hunting Grounds. Now, it is a enchantment, like I said, that is in Selesnya, both meaning a blue and a green and a white enchantment, my bad. And it has Threshold. And in this case, whenever an opponent plays a spell, you may put a creature card from your hand into play. And Threshold meaning you have at least 7 or more cards in your graveyard. So this is a very unique card for the fact that it really doesn't do anything until, again, 7 cards are in the grave. And like I said before, green and white don't really like to have stuff with the grave. I mean, yeah, they can recur some stuff, but they're not really trying to pour out their deck into the grave. So this is unusual. But this is a very, very powerful card, especially for just 2 mana.
Yeah, and you know what it kind of reminds me of? A card like Lurking Predators that's also in green, which happens, whenever an opponent casts a spell, you get something. This sort of reminds me of that, except for the fact that Hunting Grounds is a lot more conditional, yet it comes down earlier. So which is better? I don't really know, honestly. I would argue probably Lurking Predators, because it picks right from the top of the deck, which is an infinite, almost, resource, whereas the hand is a far more finite resource.
That's a fair point.
So if you run out of creatures in your hand, Hunting Grounds isn't doing much for you. And if you play this too early in the game or too late in the game, Hunting Grounds, again, really isn't going to do anything for you, because you've either haven't had a graveyard yet or you've exhausted your hand entirely. I don't love the fact that this doesn't do anything if you don't have Threshold. However, I will balance that out by saying if this is on, it's really on.
Oh,
And this
yeah.
is very scary to have to play against something like this where any little thing you play is going to result in somebody else dropping a giant creature out of their hand at instant speed. That's really scary.
Well, this is like, I would say, a car alarm. Like, you might hear it down the road and it's going to bother you a little bit, but once it gets even closer, you're going to be really worried. Like, all right, is my car kind of safe? Like, I know it's a bizarre analogy right there, but literally, as soon as this hits, everyone's going to take note. Everyone's going to evaluate that. And once it gets close to 6 or, I mean, even 5, people are probably going to blow it up just for the fact that it is just scary, even if you don't have a creature in your hand.
I mean, I probably wouldn't play this out unless I was sure that I had Threshold and could immediately do something with it, because then, and this is one of the scariest parts about this, even if you play this out, if it's already on and somebody tries to answer it with a removal spell for a creature or for this, you still get to drop at least one creature out of your hand, and
Exactly.
who knows what that's going to be.
Yeah, so you at least get one trade out for it. And for 2 mana, yeah, I'll gladly trade this out. It's like a flash pretty much for in green. It's a better version. And again, if you're running, I don't know, Bant or any kind of 4-color deck that has this, yeah, this could be serviceable. So it's just a unique tech card. I've rarely seen it played, and I would love to actually see more of it. Again, in a deck that could use it.
For sure. And speaking of cards that I think should see more play, I'm going to go on to my number 7 now here and talk a little about Guilt Feeder. This is a black creature. It costs 5 mana, 3 colorless and 2 black, and it's a 0/4. Guilt Feeder can't be blocked except by artifact creatures and or black creatures. We know this as Fear. Also, when Guilt Feeder attacks and isn't blocked, the defending player loses 1 life for each card in their graveyard. Okay, so where does this card shine? I'll tell you right now, in a mill deck. And the reason I say that is because this card I see as kind of a mill deck's secret weapon. There is a small handful of cards like this that actually do very similar sorts of effects, and the way this really, really shines is if you play it in, like I said, a mill deck, but specifically a deck like Phoenix, God of Deception. Now, this is twofold, because not only does Guilt Feeder play well in mill decks, but Phoenix likes creatures with big butts, as it were.
It's all about the booty.
And so the fact that Guilt Feeder's a 0/4 and not that intimidating in terms of stats actually works very well to your advantage, because the more toughness, the better. But really, when you think about it, Guilt Feeder doesn't need to have any power of its own at all, because its effect is going to be doing all the work for you most of the time.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, this could even work in a deck what you would typically see Walls or Defenders or Dorgan Siege.
Oh, yeah,
deck,
definitely.
because it's all about the big butts,
Yeah.
like you said. But yeah, I've never seen this card used. I've been milled out many times. I've always hate when someone goes ahead and tunnel visions me for just game right off the bat. But typically mill strategies fall short for the fact that it's a multiplayer game, in which that you typically can get... And we're back.
All right.
After a quick blackout. But either way, like I was saying, it's typically you can see a person can typically get 1 person out of the game, maybe even 2, but you start running out of answers, especially with 3 people gunning down your neck. So this could be something really easy to lock someone out of the game really quick without having to use all your resources. So I mean, it is a serviceable card.
Yeah, and of course it does have to go unblocked, so maybe you need some more support like that, but there is the element of it having fear, which makes most decks have a very, very difficult time trying to block it, especially the decks like green or red that you're most interested in milling most of the time.
True.
So the fact that it has such a small body actually kind of works to your advantage, and when you consider cards like Traumatize that mill someone for half their deck, this thing just starts swinging in for about 50 damage right off, so that's actually really, really good, and something I think more mill decks should take note of.
True, but 5 mana is pretty steep. It is mono black. You can get the mana boost from like staples you see with Crypt Gas or a Borg and such, but it is, like I said, I think it should be in almost every mill deck as a staple, like you were saying,
definitely.
but I want to like it so much more, but I would hate playing against it. If that thing was coming at me, I would just despise it. But it might be even better in like the other Mill Commander who has Mind Funeral built onto him. I can't remember his name.
Marco Vosk, that's right.
Yeah, because he's all about having the evasive hits
and more milling consistently. Yeah.
I mean, typically he goes synonymously in any deck that uses mill, like Thanax. So, I mean, you might need it in a different one particularly, but serviceable nonetheless.
Oh yeah, well. This card was very, very niche. Let's go on to one that I think has a much wider appeal.
All right. Well, for my number 6, I'm going to be going back into a land, and this one is called Crozen Verge. Now, Crozen Verge does come into play tapped, and it also has the ability to tap to produce 1 colorless mana. But it also has the second effect in which you put 2 generic mana into it, tap it, sack it, search your library for a forest and a plains card, and put it into play tapped. So this is another arsenal in both green and white, and I've found a lot of green-white stuff here that I typically don't see in Magic. I'm sorry if it seems like I'm riding that side of the pie, but they were just cards that I had to just take note of because I was just kind of wowed with.
Well, and there's a reason for that, Stu, because Judgment followed up Torment, and they kind of did a weird thing in these couple sets where they focused on some colors more than others. Torment was all about black and red cards, and there are actually more black cards and more red cards in Torment than in the other colors. It's kind of out of balance on the color pie. Judgment was the same, except they leaned the other way and they went with green and white. So that's why there are so many awesome green and white cards in Judgment.
Very Judge Judy of them. I like this card too for another reason. Also, like one card you do see in Magic across the board is Myriad Landscape. And that is just serviceable for the same exact thing that just gets 2 basic lands into play. You're doing the same thing, but this one has a nice color skin to it in the fact that it can get any forest and any plains. So if you think about that, that's any dual land, any shock land, anything that the cycle lands even?
Yeah, definitely.
So,
Crozen Verge it basically is a Myriad Landscape, except Myriad only gets 2 of the same color land. Crozen Verge gets you possibly 2 colors, which is very nice. Possibly even more, because like you said, Stu, you can get all kinds of lands that are dual colored and just have the plains or forest subtype, or even monocolored lands with special abilities like a Mistveil Plains or something like that.
Yeah.
But this is really, really cool, and definitely one that I include in pretty much every deck that has the colors for, because I'm not a huge fan of the pay 1 life, sacrifice, fetch lands, and commander. I mean, they're fine. I just don't think they're necessary. Something like this, though, that gives you a 2-for-1, now I'm start getting interested.
Yeah, and I would also choose it over an Evolving Wilds or a Terramorphic Expanse.
Definitely.
I've never been a huge fan of those unless you are one to care about the grave count, or if you're going for something for thinning for whatever reason, just for consistency. But it's such a good card. I've rarely seen it. It's not even like it's expensive. It's not like, oh, it's this hidden kind of gem that's like $13. Like, no, this is really cheap, and honestly, Bant decks could use this. I mean, like put any other tail color on there, it would be perfectly fine, and it would fix all of your mana.
It's gotten reprinted a lot too, so you should definitely know this card exists. And if you're not playing it, my question to you is, why not? But
that's profound, Kyle. Yeah. Very deep there.
All right, well, going on to my number 6 here, we're talking about another creature, and it's called Cephalid Constable. Now, this is a Cephalid wizard creature that costs 3 mana, 1 colorless, and 2 blue, a 1/1. And whenever Cephalid Constable deals combat damage to a player, return up to X target permanents that player controls to their owner's hands, where X is the damage it dealt to that player. So once you start thinking about this, aside from its small body and through the lens of what happens when this thing is maybe, I don't know, made unblockable or something and can actually hit someone, things start getting really intimidating, because keep in mind, it says permanents, not non-land permanents, not creatures, not any specific thing, permanents. The fact that this can bounce lands like something like a Tidespout Tyrant makes it really, really scary. And the only way this works, however, is if it's able to get through for damage, which, being a little 1/1 with no evasive abilities of its own, might be a bit difficult. But keep in mind, you have so many options, like Thassa, God of the Sea, or Whisper Silk Cloak, or any one of a million different things. Like, the new commander from Dominaria, Tetsuko Omizawa, is wonderful for this card.
I'm amazed you could say that, because I've been trying to say that card for weeks at this point. And you literally took the words out of my mouth, Kyle. Those are 2 cards that are perfect examples of what this card can utilize to make it so it's a threat. But also, even if you don't, this pretty much obligates your opponents to go ahead and sacrifice a creature to it, or block it, or obligate it so that they are taking more damage, because inherently they hate this card. Like, why wouldn't you hate this card? It's getting rid of your lands for the most part, which is probably the most important part of all of Magic. So being able to totally go ahead and host strategies just by eating up their mana, yeah, yikes, especially for this mana cost. Tidespout Tyrant is an expensive, I think 8, 9
Oh,
drop.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
So getting this way sooner in the game, you are getting an advantage, 100%.
Yeah, I mean, if you're unguarded and this thing comes down on turn 3 and you still don't have any answers, you better get nervous. And especially, you think about slapping some equipments on this thing so that its power is boosted. Wow, that's going to be very, very frightening early in the game, or really almost any stage in the game, depending on how powerful you can make it.
Yeah, if you're having elements, make sure you can give it haste, the board's open, pop it, go into it. If you go ahead and you make it so it's stronger with an Anthem effect, or like a commander can boost it, or, I mean, if this was a bird, you go ahead and use that enchantment you're talking about before, yeah, very scary. So.
Yeah.
So that is our pool time for today, and if you like the cards that we had in our pool, please let us know your thoughts and opinions of where they stand and how they affect the game for you.
And you can let us know either in the comments down below, or you can reach out to us on social media at our Reddit, Twitter, and Facebook pages, all at the handle MTG The Card Pool. And stay tuned for next week, where we'll take a look at some more hidden gems from Judgment.
Indeed, Kyle. And I'm Stu Galetta. Until then,
I'm Kyle Robertson.
and we'll see you next time
At the Card Pool.